Finally, as promised, here are my patterns for the row counters. Right here you can see the knitted version of the row counter. And here is the crochet version. When you put row counters onto your knitting, you want to put it on the opposite side that you're holding your yarn. So you can see here I'm holding the yarn to the back and I'm sliding the row counter onto the front of the knitting. This is important because you don't want to slide it onto the back and sandwich it in between your knitting and your yarn, because that will cause a bulge and it will mess with your gauge on your knitting. So you can see here at the end again, I'm sliding it onto the front of the knitting on the opposite side where I'm holding the yarn, so it's not getting sandwiched in between the yarn and my work. These row counters work best for larger size needle projects because the size of the holes are bigger. You can remedy this, however, by using a smaller size needle. Again, you can see here, I'm placing it on the front side of the work on the opposite side where I hold my yarn as I work down. Now you don't necessarily have to sandwich it in between the stitches like you see here when you're working with straight knitting needles. However, I do like to use it here because it helps lock these row counters into place. This is also how you would work with them if you were to use them on circular knitting needles. Also, you can see that I have one at either end. That's just to show you how each one individually would work. One's the crochet, one's the knitted version. So it's just so you can see them both in action. I will go ahead and mark where I start talking about the knitting pattern or crochet pattern itself, if you would like to go ahead and skip to that point. I would like to discuss some useful applications of row counters, including a use that I have for them in my knitting projects. So please stay tuned if you'd like to hear more about that. And also, if you do have something that you use row counters for that you'd like to be able to share, put it down in the comments below. So when would you actually want to use a row counter? You will want to use a row counter when you need a place of reference in knitting, such as when the pattern instructs you to knit a number of rows. I'm sure you've noticed at some point in your knitting where you go to measure something and the number of rows that you have worked isn't the same when you measure from one side of your knitting to the other. By using a row counter, you can ensure your symmetry in your projects. This comes in real handy when you're working on something like socks or in shaping of more complex patterns like sweaters. You can also use row counters to track where you are within a repeat, such as when you're working lace or even when you're working with cables. You don't always need a row counter, and its use can vary based on your project. However, there is a more subtle way that I like to use a row counter. I talked about this in a previous video and I will leave it linked below, but I like to use a row counter to avoid the void of knitting. That is, I use it as a reminder to take breaks. Sometimes when I am knitting, I lose track of time and I don't allow myself the breaks my body needs. Some knitters and crocheters also struggle with this and can develop repetitive stress injuries or RSI. By using a row counter, I can track how much knitting I have done and when I need to take a break. Alright, so without much further ado, let's get this started. If you are crocheting and you want to use a row counter, I would suggest using a stitch marker to help you track your rows. You can use this same technique when you're knitting multiples of 10 as well. I have a video where I also talk about putting beads on your knitting, and I do go a little bit more in depth on that video. So I like to use fishing line. You can see here that this is a 12-pound test weight. And I also like to use a sewing needle as well. So the way this works is you take the fishing line and you put it through the eye of the needle. And you do this at least 2 times. So you're not really tying a knot, but you are securing it to the needle itself. You can also stick the fishing line through that first hole to kind of tie it down if you'd like to do that as well. And here I'm just trying to go through a second time. Once that's done and that fishing line is secure, you are ready to start putting on the beads. Now you want to choose a good size bead to go with your yarn. You don't want something that is going to distort your stitches or anything like that, so keep that in mind. You also want a bead that has a big enough hole for the needle to be able to go through. Now with your first bead, you don't have to do any special knots. What you're going to do is you're going to go through it at least once, and then you are going to go through it a second time at least. And you can see here I go through it 3 times. Now what this does is it secures the bead in place without having to worry about any special knots. So now we are ready to go in and add some more beads to the thread. And you can do this however you like. You can see I'm picking them up from the bottle. Now I'm pouring them into my hand, and I'm just going to scoop them up out of my hand. Now I personally like this method because I can have the beads on the thread and they're very portable, so I can use this and transport it with me. If you use this method though, I would encourage you on every so often to go ahead and loop back through a bead. Should be showing you that in a second. You can see here how they're sliding back and forth. Now I'm just simply going back through one of the beads to create a little loop around it, and just by adding that little extra string in there, it prevents the beads from sliding around. So now that we got that stopper bead on there, you're just ready to continue to add more beads. I do like this method better than stringing the beads onto the yarn because you don't have to worry about adding the exact amount of beads or running out of the beads that you've already added onto there. Also, when you add beads just to the yarn itself, it can cut into the yarn and cause it to break over time, so that's not really desirable either. I also prefer this to the crochet hook. As I stated before, this method is pretty portable. The crochet hook is not, and you can also end up when you're using the crochet hook to split your yarn when you're trying to place your hook into the bead and grab the yarn and pull it out. This method loops around the whole entire yarn strand, so you don't have to worry about that. You also don't have to worry about whether or not the crochet hook will fit into the hole of the bead, or that when you again grab it, you're not going to be splitting plies. So it works with a wider variety of thicknesses of yarn. I would also encourage you, especially on the knitted version, for the 10 slot to use a different color of bead to help mark it as 10, so you can tell the difference between the two ends. The crochet version comes to a point, so it's not as hard to tell the difference between the two ends, but the knitted version, both ends look the same, so you may want to add a different color of bead on one end to help distinguish between the two. See here, we've got all the beads strung onto the string and we are ready to start. Okay, just real quick, you are using a fingering weight yarn and you also are going to want to use beads that match that yarn. So you're wanting beads that won't distort your stitches. We're using US number 6 4mm knitting needles. To cast on, I am using the long tail cast on method and we're going to start by casting on 32 stitches. At any point, if you do need this video to go slower, go into settings on YouTube, then go to playback speed, and then you can change the playback speed to go slower or faster, whatever you need it to go. Okay, for the first row, you are going to knit 2, and then after that will come the repeat. So we're knitting 1, knit 2, and now we are going to place a bead onto the knitting. So you're going to put the needle through the knitting loop, and then you are going to go back through the bead that is on your string, and then you're going to pull the knitted loop through the bead. And once you do that, you're going to place that stitch back onto your knitting needle, and then you are going to take your needle back through the knitted loop. And hopefully your knitting needle won't slip out of your knit stitches like mine wants to do. And then you are going to knit that stitch with the bead on it. Knit the next stitch, and you are going to bind off that next stitch. Knit the next stitch. Place your bead, knit that stitch with the bead, knit the next stitch, bind off that stitch with the bead, knit the next stitch, place a bead on that next stitch, knit the stitch with the bead, knit the next stitch, bind off, stitch with bead, and knit the next stitch. And you're just going to keep on repeating that. So you're going to place the bead, knit the stitch with the bead, knit the next stitch, bind off, stitch with bead, and knit the next stitch. On the next row, you're going to start with knit 2. So knit 1, knit 2, and then you're going to yarn over twice. So yarn over once, yarn over twice, knit 2 together, yarn over once, yarn over twice, knit 2 together. So you're going to just repeat that. Yarn over once, yarn over twice, knit 2 together. And you're going to repeat that to the last 2 stitches. So here we are at the last 2 stitches. Once, yarn over twice. Just going to do a quick count of the stitches before I do the next step. So you're looking for about probably 33 stitches at the very end. So we're just going to knit the next 2 stitches. Knit 1 and knit 2. Alright, just to give you a heads up here, on the next row things are going to get a little bit weird. On all the yarn over stitches you will knit through the back loop. So here we go, knit 1, knit 2, and we're going to bind off, and here we're going to knit through the back loop on that yarn over. If you need to drop off that first yarn over, you can. Just make sure you pick it back up again. And then we're going to bind off that last knit stitch, and we're knitting through the back loop. And we are putting a bead on that stitch that we just knit the back loop on. And of course my knitting needle just had to come out of the loop again, but I'll worry about it in a second. Alright, we're slipping that knitted stitch that we had on there before. That's an extra yarn that we don't need on there. And now we're gonna bind off that stitch first. Now you can see I picked up the yarn over loop, and we're going to knit it into the next knit stitch through the back loop. The reason for this is so we can secure the yarn over stitches so it's all connected to the yarn and we don't have any random strands hanging out. Alright, so we're going to do it again. So we're knitting the yarn over through the back loop. We're binding off that stitch. We're knitting the next yarn over through the back loop. We're going to place a bead on it. Place that stitch back onto the knitting needle, and then we're going to bind it off. Alright, and you're going to pick up that yarn over strand and you're going to knit through that back loop with that knitted stitch, and you're going to bind it off. And you're just going to repeat that process. So we're knitting through the back loop of the yarn over, we're binding off, we're knitting through the back loop on the next yarn over, and then we're going to place a bead on it, then we're going to bind off, then we're going to knit with the yarn over strand in the knit stitch through the back loop, and we're just going to repeat that to the end. So the reason we're doing it this way is so that the bead will sit vertically instead of horizontally on your knitting. So you can kind of see later on, I think I'll show you that the way that it sits within the knitting, it just sits the same way. If you were to have the bead sitting on the bind off edge, it would be sitting horizontally instead of vertically. And again, I didn't do it for this one that I made, but you can add a different color bead to one end of the knitting to help you differentiate between which side is 1 and which side is 10. Alright, so now it's time to weave in the ends, which you can see that I am currently working on doing. There's several different ways you can do this. I think the method that I used in here was to kind of split the plies in between each of the rows worked. I also kind of did kind of a looping method, which is similar to what you use on rib, kind of just catching the little corners of the little V's and going up and down those to weave in the ends. The yarn that I used is a wool yarn, and it really likes to kind of go in and stick to itself, so it doesn't really require a whole lot of weaving and securing in of ends as much as cotton does, because cotton's really slippery. So as you can see from some of the glances you may have grabbed, it doesn't really sit quite as nicely as I'd like it to. So we are actually going to go ahead and block it a little bit. So we're just adding some clean water, just kind of mixing it in. And then we're going to add some detergent, some cleaning liquid, just a little bit. And we're going to mix that in. Squeeze it out and then stir it up, and we're just going to do a quick rinse. And now it's ready to dry, so we're just going to take a towel and fold it over and just kind of roll and squish it, just to get all of that extra moisture out, so it doesn't take quite as long to dry. And just do it one more time for good measure. And now we will secure it in place. And that will help open up those eyelets. As you can see here, it's really opening them up. And we just leave it to sit to dry. And now that it's dried, we're going to just take those out. And you can see how it's pretty much holding its shape. It's not really going back. The ones that did move, it's kind of more me than anything else. You can see it with these other ones, the bottom ones, and then that one just wanted to attach itself. And here you could see it's nice and sitting open, and here you can see what I was talking about, the vertical versus horizontal. You can see those sit vertically in the knitting, and they're the same on both top and bottom. Crochet version. Okay, same thing that I said with the knitting. We're using a fingering weight yarn, and make sure you choose the correct size of beads, ones that aren't going to distort your crochet. I forgot to show you guys the size of crochet hook I am using in this video, but it is a size E crochet hook. Again, size E crochet hook. So we're going to do a slip knot, and then we're going to chain one, and we're going to place a bead on that chain one. All right, so now we're going to chain 1, 2, 3, and place bead. And that's going to be your repeat. So we're going to chain 3, place bead. And you're going to do that 7 more times from this point. And you'll have a total of 9 beads on your crochet chain when you're done. We're going to chain 3, chain 1, chain 2, chain 3, place bead. That's going to be your repeat. I have another video that I will try to link here that goes a little bit more in depth on how to use beads when knitting and crocheting. And we just placed a bead and we're going to chain 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. All right, 9 beads. So we should be chaining 5. So we already chained 3, 4. One more be 5. And now we're going to place a bead on there. So we're going to chain 3, and then after that we're going to do a double crochet. So we're going to chain 1, 2, 3, and then we're going to do a double crochet into the 3rd stitch from the bead. So we're going to yarn over, insert the hook into that 3rd stitch from that first bead, and then we're going to yarn over the hook again and pull that loop through. We're going to yarn over the hook and pull it through the first 2 stitches, and we're going to yarn over the hook and grab that yarn and pull it through the next 2 stitches. You see that bead makes a nice little point on there, and then we're going to chain 1, and then we're going to place a bead onto that stitch. Alright, and then we are going to chain 1 more, and then we're going to do a double crochet 1 stitch in from that bead. So we're going to do a yarn over. We're going to insert that crochet hook into that or stitch in there. We're going to pull a loop through, yarn over, pull in that loop through the first 2 stitches, yarn over, pull in that stitch through the next 2, and then we're going to chain 1, place bead, and we're going to chain 1 more after that, and that's going to be your repeat. So after placing that bead, you're going to chain 1, and then you're going to do a double crochet. So it's going to be double crochet, chain 1, place bead, chain 1, double crochet, crochet 1, place bead, crochet 1, double crochet, and you're just going to repeat that till you get to the end. If you need a more in-depth tutorial on how to do a double crochet, I will try to link a tutorial here in this video that you can reference. And this is going to be your last crochet. So it's going to be a double crochet and you're doing it into that slip stitch. Basically, that's on the other side of that bead that you use to start this chain with. Might take a little bit of fiddly work to get in there. And that's going to be your last stitch, is that double crochet into that slip knot basically. And you're just gonna bind off and weave in your ends.
All I want, 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 all All I want.
And here I am just doing a real quick blocking of these row counters. So that's my knitted and my crocheted row counter. If you'd like to see more videos from me, please go ahead and subscribe. And if you have any other tips that weren't mentioned in this video for row counters, please share by adding them in the comments below.